There's a saying for games and sports that you should play to win, and more importantly, you shouldn't play to not lose. I think most people implicitly understand this distinction, even if they can't explain why. This is because playing to win implies a level of control, engagement, and active participation that playing to not lose doesn't. That interaction is what we play games or sports for in the first place, so why would we run from that? Usually, it's not a decision of our own, it's a decision forced upon us by an opponent who's so domineering that it almost feels like we're not even playing the game. That feeling sucks. It sucks in games, it sucks in sports, and it sucks just as much in video games. Video games as a medium require interaction. And interaction requires, well, action. It requires active intent and decision making, because video games have endless possibilities and only collapse into one specific instance as a result of player interaction. In this manner, the player dictates the state of the game. In a truly single player game, where the player is the only thing affecting the state of the game, for example, a puzzle where there is no lose condition, the only thing a player can do is play to win. This is not only their mindset, but their only ability. There is no mechanism, no system saying that you lose. You could theoretically not win, but that isn't the same as losing. In a competitive game, though, one with direct competition between two players, both of the players affect the state of the game, and there arises a need to not play purely as you see fit. Now, player 1 has to react to player two's decisions and the results of those decisions. In this new paradigm, there is now a lose condition. Each turn, you still have the ability to interact with the game, but now the idea strategy is introduced, as you, the player, don't have full control of the game anymore. You could play aggressively, or you could play defensively. You could play to win, or you could play to not lose. To be clear, all four of these are distinct ways of approaching the problem. Don't conflate playing defensively with playing to not lose, because when you're playing defensively, there's an active decision to take control of the state of the game. You're not reacting, you're acting in preparation. You're making a move amongst moves for your chance to win. On the other hand, when you play to not lose, you're not acting, you're reacting to the state of the game. You're not defensive, you are passive, and at its extremes, you're not actually dictating anything about the game. As such, it can't even be considered a game anymore, because you aren't even playing. Imagine a video game where the only objective was to cross a 10-mile long hallway. Ooh, how interesting. And you control a character that moves at a speed of 1 foot per second. The game has a mechanic where randomly, at any moment in the game, your character can be forced to restart their journey at the very beginning. Also, there's an additional mechanic where the character's controls are not fully dictated by the player, and again randomly, your player can veer off the straight path, which also results in the player restarting their journey if the stray movement is not corrected within, say, half a second. This is a difficult game. It's a game that might even be impossible to beat. So would anyone enjoy this game? Of course not. When people say they want difficulty in their games, they are clearly assuming many underlying design decisions that are not present in the previous example. Otherwise, I would have just described one of the most exciting games ever made. But no, what the previous example lacks, among many things, is the effective use of randomness and engaging gameplay. You can't predict randomness, and humans perceive an innate sense of unfairness in mechanics that are random, especially when they're not biased towards the player. When a game mechanic feels unfair, there is no reason to believe in the validity of any of the other systems of the games or its rewards. The player, spiteful or frustrated, now has an underlying assumption that this game isn't actually meant to be played, and in the same way that an athlete will start to play to not lose against a difficult opponent, the player is completely stripped of their agency and their ability to interact with the game. Since interactivity is what defines a game, it means that the player at that point isn't really even playing a game. They're but a bystander or an NPC. I say all this, but randomness appears in practically every game, and for good reason. By itself, it isn't bad design, it's a choice and a tool to help create more varied experiences. That's a fine tightrope to walk on though, and if not implemented properly, and if the player feels it is unfair, it can lead to unfun and unengaging mechanics. Our fictional game from earlier has many problems, sure, but amongst them is a fundamental misunderstanding of randomness. Whether or not you get reset to the beginning of your journey after 1 step or 500, you aren't actually getting a different experience. The randomness in mechanics does not result in randomness of play. This is the fundamental problem. Why is this randomness different from, say, the randomness of randomly generated rooms in a rogue game? It's because the latter actually causes the player to interact with the game differently, whereas the former will always result in the same behavior for the player. Which leads to our next problem. The behavior the player is forced into, since they have no other options, is fucking boring. Who cares about walking a mile in some empty liminal space with no reward and some reoccurring random setback? I don't care. It's not fun, nor is it interesting. There needs to be a justification for every design choice made in the game, and sloppily throwing in new ideas like random values without actually wondering what the end goal is will always result in a worse product than had there been proper thought put into the design. This was a lot of explanation to talk about Elden Ring, but I want to say that while difficulty is a complicated thing, there have been many developers and many games who have been able to tackle the problem effectively. FromSoft is so famed for this that their most popular franchise has been crowned with its own eponymous genre. These people are masters of their craft, and they're experienced and clearly loved by a large audience. Elden Ring is one of the most successful games of the past decade, and right now the Shadow of the Erdtree DLC is being met with effusive praise. This is another in a long line of victories for FromSoft, right? Pause. See, the thing is that I wrote this section of the video before the larger gaming landscape had surprisingly come to the conclusion that Shadow of the Erdtree is too hard, at least according to the tanked Steam reviews and a few publications' experience with the game. I'm honestly shocked to see this because historically, the player base has been so stubborn in their understanding of From's games that they wouldn't dare criticize the difficulties of the game because any detractors would simply be hit with the infamous "get good." But see, I'm not sure if I can actually agree with the general sentiment of this wave of backlash, and I'll touch on that later. So for now, let's go back to the original question. This is another in a long line of victories for FromSoft, right? No. Elden Ring has bad game design. To be more specific, I think he has bad enemy and boss design. It's not just slightly worse than FromSoft's previous game, Sekiro. No, it is fundamentally broken on many levels, yet I've seen near zero proper criticism for this aspect of the game. From journalists and reviewers whomst I trust, there's basically nothing but praise. I won't pretend to understand what they see, because I don't, so I'll say they're simply wrong. Elden Ring's bosses are designed in such a way that the player is stripped of all agency. Most bosses have a unique quirk, a mechanic of optional extensions in which bosses can perform an attack, but sometimes randomly and completely unpredictably, the boss can follow that attack with another. As an example, say the player sees the boss do a move they've seen before, and now the boss has left itself vulnerable. If the player decides to attack, they can be 1. Not attacked and rewarded with a small amount of damage inflicted against the boss, or 2. The boss could potentially go into an optional extension, attacking the player again and taking off a significant chunk of the player's health. Whether the boss chooses to attack or not is completely random, except for the fact that it only happens when the player tries to punish the boss. Meaning, you can punish the boss's moves, but you will have no idea whether or not the boss will retaliate. There is no question of risk versus reward here, since bosses do much more damage to the player than the player does to the boss. Relatively frequently, bosses can outright kill the player due to a simple extension like this. This decision, quote-unquote, that's presented to the player is not a decision at all. It's an illusion of choice. You will almost never punish the boss after they do a move you know has an optional extension. So even though the extension is random, you yourself will always react in the same way. The randomness of mechanics does not result in randomness of behavior. This is randomness misunderstood. It is the same principle as our example earlier. The game implements randomness in a way that does not actually lead to different outcomes, i.e., the player will always run from the boss. And again, just like our fictional games example, the behavior the player is forced into itself is extremely unfun. Constantly having to run away after a boss attacks is the exact opposite of what you want in a Souls game. It also feels unfair because in response to this extension, you aren't allowed to do anything. You are stripped of agency. If you try to punish the boss and it is an optional extension while you still can't move, tough luck. This makes the bosses so overbearing that you can't play to win. You are forced to play to not lose. You are forced to be passive and to simply just sit back and watch as the boss stupidly flails around until they do their one move which you know doesn't have an optional extension, just to get a sliver of health from them. That is ridiculous. The most important part of this is not that the boss goes into an optional extension. The problem is that since the player can't react, they're forced into one extremely boring behavior. Limiting the player's ability to react in a vacuum is a design choice, but when paired with this specific boss design philosophy, it's a problem. It's such a massive design flaw and such an insane oversight that it might be hard to understand how it made it into the game. But in reality, there's a very direct lineage of philosophy from FromSoftware's previous title, Sekiro. In Sekiro, bosses have the exact same ability to extend moves optionally, completely randomly, but there is one massive difference between Elden Ring's combat and Sekiro's combat. In Sekiro, the player can react at any time with a parry. In fact, the parry will even override and cancel the player's attacks, not only making it more forgiving, but empowering. This allows the designers to make the bosses more complex and allows them to have moves that need to be reacted to and can't simply be memorized. It also gives the player real agency, as they can't just be pushed around by the boss and aren't forced to be passive, reacting to the boss. They can actually play to win. Because of the way Sekiro's posture and parry systems work, it is actually to the advantage of the player that the bosses have more and more attacks, as that means more opportunities for parries, which means more posture damage on the boss, which then means the opportunity for a death blow. Parrying is not only a viable strategy, it is the best strategy in the game. This is an option that the player is afforded, but to even use this takes skill and practice and active engagement with every single strike of the enemy's weapon. It's not up to chance, it's a controllable reality, something for the player to grasp and learn, which creates engagement and satisfaction. Now, if you take the wrong lesson from Sekiro and think that what players want is more complicated bosses with unpredictable movesets and try to implement that into a game where the player doesn't have the same ability to react, you get Elden Ring. Every major boss in Elden Ring has optional extensions. Every player has encountered them, and every player has had the feeling for one boss fight or another that they just have to sit back and let the boss flail around for a second. They wait, and they wait, and they wait for the opportunity to get one attack in, and then they run away to repeat the entire process again until the boss is defeated. In the moment, people might attribute their discomfort with this idea of needing to wait around simply to anger or impatience, and might fall for the idea that they're the ones who are bad at the game. But in this instance, it's simply not true. You, as a player, are at one moment being told to engage with the mechanic of the game, to watch for openings in a boss's defense, to strike, and in the next, you're being punished for doing so. This is not your fault. It is a failure of design. What makes this situation even worse is the fact that Elden Ring has an entire list of other problems with its combat beyond just optional extensions. There's the problem of the ridiculous input reading mechanic, where the second you press an input, say to heal, the enemy can react instantly, in a way that is unnatural, sure, but more importantly removes all agency from the player, because unlike Sekiro, the player can't counter. The vast majority of the time it takes for the player to heal is longer than the time it takes for the enemy to read your input and attack. This once again stops players from engaging with one of the core mechanics of the game, and presents an illusion of choice, this time that you can heal. It's not a skill check, it's a denial of choice. It gets worse, because now that the player knows that the boss will react so strictly and robotically to the player's actions, they develop a new strategy of trying to bait the enemy's AI into certain moves so that the player can run away or heal without worrying about being input read. Is this what the fantasy of Souls-like games is? To jump through hoops and to manipulate the enemy AI so that you can simply run away and heal, to then hopefully engage with the actual fun parts of the boss? No. It definitely is not. And the problems keep going. Unpredictable animations making the player rely more on memorization than reaction. That isn't to say that reaction-based attacks are the end-all be-all, but Elden Ring's bosses rely so much on memorizing specific, unnatural, and unintuitive timings for boss attacks that as the game progresses, there is no innate feeling of growth for the player's skill, beyond the arbitrary stat increases which are rendered effectively meaningless because the game's difficulty increases with you as well. So, not only does it feel like enemies have been the same difficulty the whole time, you also don't feel that much more skilled at the game since the game isn't actually asking you to get better at playing Elden Ring. No, it's asking you to get better at fighting Margit, or Malenia, or Radahn, or whichever specific enemy. Asking players to memorize different patterns for bosses is completely understandable, and to be honest, leaning more towards game mastery versus fight mastery is a design choice. But Elden Ring's weird obsession with inane attack timings breaks the flow of combat and removes the sense of grounded combat that punctuates the success of the Souls genre. It isn't a preference to have a Souls game that doesn't feel like a Souls game. That's just bad design. Aside from animation timings, there's the absolutely egregious problems of attack queuing, where it feels like no AI is conscious of any other attack the player is facing at the moment. This leads to the player having to dodge multiple attacks at only slightly delayed intervals, which are not within a short enough span to avoid with a single dodge, but are not spread apart enough to have the time to avoid both attacks. So, by default, you have to get hit by one of the attacks. This is atrocious, and it's an issue that has been avoided in countless amounts of games, and one that FromSoft definitely has the resources to handle. One shining example is Rellana, Twin Moon Knight, in the new Shadow of the Erdtree DLC. She at one moment can cast a spell that attacks you on a delay, and in the next can attack you with a magic greatsword that will kill you if not dodged. Even if not on the first swing, it will kill you on the second swing as a result of the flinch from the first attack. So, now what do? Do you dodge the magic arrows that will end at the same time as you will inevitably run out of invincibility frames, causing you to be hit by the sword? Or do you get hit by the arrows, either potentially die, or get stunned long enough that once again, you can't avoid the inevitable sword hit, which, as we've established, will kill you? Oh, what's that? In all of these scenarios you die and have no choice? Huh, weird. Anyway, this interaction is definitely super fair and should be in the final release. Rellana is only one of the many bosses and enemies that do this. It utterly tanks the perceived level of intelligence when the AI does stuff like this, and it is not fun to play against. This, again, like all of the previously mentioned problems, is so fundamental to the core design of Elden Ring's enemies that you can't fix it by changing any one single enemy. You can't just point to Margit and say, haha, laugh at the weirdo boss that nobody likes, because we would have to do that with every boss. And also, I like Margit, guys, don't laugh at him. Finally, the problem of balance is one that I've actually heard a decent amount of discussion about when the base game was released, and now there's a whole new capital D discourse about it. An extremely large number of players have said that they find the DLC too difficult. I feel the need to say that beyond anything, if you think that using any mechanic implemented by FromSoft in this game is unfair because of your pre-existing assumption that the game is quote-unquote fair, then you've already lost the plot. Elden Ring is not built to be fair. It doesn't have reasonable, consistent mechanics, and it's ridiculous to pretend that pure deck strength builds are the only way to keep the game fair. There is no fair in Elden Ring, and the closest you will get to that definition is actually by using things like Spirit Ashes and magic, because they even the playing field. They give you an actual choice between trading damage or not, since you have the ability to do more damage with spells and incantations than a simple strength dex build. And if you're using Spirit Ashes, you can rely on your summon to get that boss's attention, which creates new, actually random scenarios and openings to attack the boss. Above all, just let people have fun, you fucking dweebs. And as far as the discourse goes, I think that there isn't actually a large jump in difficulty between the base game and Shadow of the Erdtree. It's not the least bit surprising that a Souls game is hard. Seriously, what did people expect? No, rather I think this is just an example of people complaining about a symptom without understanding the cause. Elden Ring has been too hard since day one. People have just refused to recognize all of the blatant flaws in the game's combat design and continue to do so, instead turning their anger at this vague, amorphous, increased difficulty. I hope that maybe this video can change some people's understanding of the game and help them communicate their frustrations better. The game isn't just too difficult, it's unfun because of the various mechanics FromSoft has implemented that reduce player engagement and force the player into a specific play-to-not-lose mentality, which is passive and boring. With Elden Ring, people tend to give simple yet correct critiques of the game every now and then, but then quickly turn around to call Elden Ring a perfect game or one of the best games ever made. It baffles me, because the truest showing of appreciation of something is the ability to be able to acknowledge its flaws. It's okay to say that Elden Ring has bad mechanics, that it has a bloated world, and that it has problems. Miyazaki isn't going to burst through your door and break your computer and slap you. It's okay to criticize things you love, or moreover to criticize things you wish were better. It's okay to say that Sekiro is 100 times better than Elden Ring, Because it is, and it's completely okay to say that Elden Ring has bad game design, because it does. Critique is the only way we can nurture better games, which will then go on to be critiqued as well, repeating the cycle ad infinitum.